are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation's Coping with Loss webinar. We are glad that you're able to join us this evening, and we hope that you find the presentation helpful. Before I turn the presentation over to our guest, Dr. Schuurman, just a few housekeeping notes before we start. If at any point during the presentation you need technical assistance, please type in your concern into the chat window. If you have any audio issues, you should be able to switch between using your computer speakers and your phone if needed. In order to provide the highest quality session today and avoid background noises, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode and are muted. Your questions are encouraged and welcome during the presentations. You can submit questions via the question box located on your control panel. We'll be taking questions during the last 15 minutes of the presentation, so please feel welcome to submit your questions as you think of them, and then we'll address them at the conclusion of the talk. This session is also being recorded, and we'll be posting it on our website, so you'll be able to access the information again at a later date. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Donna Schuurman is the Senior Director of Advocacy and Training for the Dougy Center for Grieving Children and Families in Portland, Oregon, where she has served in various roles since 1986, including Executive Director for 25 years. The Dougy Center was the first peer support program for grieving children, teens, and families in the United States, and their pioneering model has been replicated in hundreds of sites throughout the world. She trains internationally on family bereavement issues and is a founding board member of the National Alliance for Grieving Children, an organization of people and programs committed to grief education and training. Donna has written extensively on topics related to bereaved children, teens, and families. Her articles and other contributions have been published in scholarly journals and textbooks, and she has been interviewed as an expert on the subject by Redbook, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, and many other consumer publications. She is also a bereaved sibling. Her parents' first child, Lynn, died 5 days after birth. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Schuurman.
It's my pleasure.
I'm going to switch it over to you.
Okay. I'm still seeing something on my screen that I don't think I want to be seeing here.
Okay.
Let me just see if I could close that.
Did it switch over to...
Okay, I think I'm good.
Okay.
I think I'm good now.
Okay, perfect. I see your screen, so we should be set.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I'd like to welcome those who have joined us this evening, and I recognize that we may have a variety of listeners. Some of you may be a bereaved parent or parents. Some of you may be family or friends who want to support a family member or friends who've experienced the death of a child. And some of you may be professionals who would like to know more about understanding and supporting families after they've experienced the death of a child. I am hopeful that the information that I share with you this evening will be helpful no matter what perspective you're coming from. And as Gina mentioned, I'd like to encourage you at any time to enter questions. I won't be addressing those questions until toward the end of the webinar, but feel free to put them in at any time. I'd also like to encourage any comments that you may have. They don't necessarily have to be questions. They could be something from your own experience. Trying to, it's not, just to have some information for you about the Dougy Center and my contact information. This is a photo of our center in Portland, Oregon. If anyone wants to talk with me at any point later, my email address is donna@dougy.org, and our website, dougy.org, has a lot of information that you may find helpful around grief, loss, and bereavement. We have podcasts and tip sheets and a lot of free downloadable information that you may find of help. Today, I'd like to briefly talk about 3 specific topics. The first one is the challenges for a parent or parents when a child dies. What are the unique aspects of what kinds of things you can expect to experience? Second topic is understanding and supporting siblings of a child who has died. And the third topic is just some thoughts about self-care, and also for those of you who are wishing to support each other or a friend or family member, some tips. I will add that for the last 33 years, we've been working with children and families who've experienced a death of a family member. We start with 3-year-olds and go all the way up through young adults and parents. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you this evening is what we have learned over those years. There's, as some of you may have already found, there are some quality books, for example, out there, and that are some that aren't so great. And I'm always encouraging parents to follow their own heart when it comes to understanding what they need. I'll roughly speak 10, 12 minutes on each of these topics, and then we'll leave 15 or 20 minutes for comments, questions, and discussion at the end. But first, I would like to share just a few thoughts about grief, some principles that grief is a normal response to loss. And most of us have probably heard or read about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. First of all, she was really just speaking to the experience of a dying patient, not really about grieving. And she did never mean it that there's a linear way that we grieve or that you should grieve. So grief is a normal response to loss. Many of the emotions that we experience in acute or intense grief, I've heard people say, make me feel like I'm going crazy. It's not unusual to feel depressed and sad and numb and irritated, particularly irritated by, for example, what other people think are big issues. And when you have a child die, all those, what we used to think were big issues, become pretty small issues in comparison to the loss of our child. There's often guilt. What could I have done differently? Should I have known sooner? Self-blame, anxiety, panic, anger, emptiness, helplessness, relief, abandonment. And none of these happen in any sequential order, or we think we're doing fine and all of a sudden something like a grief burst hits us. It's also not unusual to have changes in appetite and sleep and our mood. Our ability to concentrate is a big one. Certainly changes in relationships. I hear a lot of parents who've had a child die say, I feel like people are avoiding me as if it's contagious or something. Or I see people see me and not know what to say, and they get a strange look over their face. We also have a lot of changes often in our priorities and our energy. Grief is a very exhausting experience. Also, everyone responds differently. There aren't predictable stages, and one size does not fit all. How any of us respond is going to be a combination of many, many factors. The age of our child when our child died, the relationship we have with the other parent of our child, the social support that we get or the lack of social support from our extended family, from our communities. One of the things I hear a lot of people say is you find out who your friends are. You find out who's there for you and who really will be and who won't be. And sometimes that can be surprising. Who shows up, who disappears. Also, we all will respond in different ways to different losses. So, and we can't always predict what those will be. I think that's part of the challenge of grief is, and I hear people describe as waves of grief. I'm walking along and I think I'm doing better, and all of a sudden I feel like I've been knocked down by a wave. And that's why I'm not a fan of comparisons of loss. Is it worse to have a child die or a spouse die? I don't get into personally any of those conversations because I don't think it ought to be a comparison kind of thing. Just knowing that we'll respond in different ways to different losses. And also, there's no right or wrong way. Certainly, there are behaviors that help us and behaviors that don't help us so much. I like to think that all behavior is an attempt to cope. And sometimes that behavior, for example, numbing behaviors like overuse of alcohol, is an attempt to cope. It doesn't always get us the result we want, but I think that often the motivation is attempting to cope. So while there's no right or wrong way, there's no formula, there certainly are behaviors that may be helpful or behaviors that may hinder us. I believe also that within each of us, we have the natural capacity to heal, but that healing from emotional and spiritual pain, the kind we experience, the depth of our grief when a child dies, does not happen in a vacuum. Just like if you have a physical injury, you break your leg, you don't say, well, it'll heal on its own, or that horrible statement we sometimes hear, time heals all wounds. Well, time doesn't heal all wounds. If I have a broken leg and I have a bone sticking out of it and I look down and I say, oh, time heals all wounds, I'm really being foolish. What heals wounds is attending to them. And sometimes it means covering them up. Sometimes it means literally walking on them. Sometimes it means exercising. Sometimes it means resting. And the same is true for emotional wounds, such as we experience when we've had someone we love die. There's also no specific duration, like how long will you grieve? When you have a child die, you will grieve the loss of that child of life. The intensity will shift. Sometimes it'll be more intense than others. Sometimes it'll be less intense. But it's unique to each person. There's no formula. And there's also no timeline, no finish line. I can tell you that my mother, who I visited a couple of weeks ago outside of Philadelphia, who's 87 years old, first child died, my parents' first child died, Lynn, at 5 days old. And my parents then had my two brothers and myself. So I'm the only surviving girl in our family. My father also had a sister who died at 15. And I have ultimately engaged my mother in discussion about what that was like for her when her 5-day-old baby died. And even at 87, a couple of weeks ago, she looked at me and she said, I can still see her fingers and toes like it was yesterday. So, and I think it's as it should be. When we love someone, why would we want to forget them? or to put them behind us. We're always thinking about who they might have been. So looking at some of the challenges that are specific when a parent or parents have a child die, there are some, I think, more unique aspects to a child's death. One of them being what Ronnie Janoff Bowman called in a book she wrote years ago, shattered assumptions. And she talked about the loss of the assumptive world, which is saying we all have assumptions about how our lives will go. If we decide to have children or we have children, we expect that our children will outlive us. And so when a child dies, the dream for that child and for the family is shattered. For some people, that leads to questioning God, if they believe in God. Why would God let this happen? And I can tell you that a lot of our kids who participate at the Dougy Center who've had a sibling die are told lots of things that they find not helpful, like God wanted your brother or God wanted your sister, which often lead them toward resenting God if they come from a background where they have a spiritual belief or religious belief system. And when we have a child die, it does force us to relook at all of our assumptions about how we thought our lives would be and what we thought our family would look like. There's also the challenge that you really have lost a part of yourself, that your child is a part of yourself that you created. And I can tell you, parent after parent here at the Dougy Center talk about it's like a part of my heart is missing, or a piece of the puzzle is missing, or that in a way I feel like I've lost a limb or a very viable part of myself. And when you lose a part of yourself, when you lose a child, you don't just intellectually recalibrate that and say, oh, okay, now I'll be all right. It doesn't happen that way. Another challenge is you've lost your identity as a protector and a provider and a nurturer, that our role as parents is to take care of our child, to take care of our children, and we were unable to do that in such a way, and the medical profession was unable to do that in such a way. And some parents, even though they know, for example, that they're not responsible for the disease their child had, have some feeling of loss, that they couldn't protect their child, they couldn't save their child. Again, it's not always an intellectual process. It's often what your heart says, what your spirit says. And this is not universal to every parent, so if that's not your experience, I'm just sharing that I hear a lot of parents struggle with what they wish they could have done. Heading to our second topic, and understanding that we have an hour today where we could talk for many hours about all of these topics. I hope that there's something in here that you will find helpful, either confirming for you as a parent or helpful to you as someone who would like to be helpful to a family you know or your own family. A little bit about understanding and supporting siblings of a child who has died. And when we look at preschoolers, they don't really understand the finality of death. It's not unusual for a preschooler to say, I know you said Katie is dead, but will she be dead all day? Because they don't necessarily understand. They think that dead people can come back. I had a child one time recently say, her mother was saying his sister was in heaven. And it's fine to say that if you believe that. It's not helpful if you don't believe it, because the child then doesn't have a context for understanding what heaven is. And to a child who doesn't understand, hearing from a parent who doesn't even believe it, that their brother or sister is in heaven, it's really no different to them than New Jersey or Minnesota or anywhere else. So this little boy was being told his sister was in heaven. The mother didn't even believe it. It was just something she said. And she kept kind of pointing up to the sky, and the little boy, after a few days, gets really mad and says, "Get a ladder." So he's not understanding what she's talking about. Now, if you believe that your child is in heaven, it's fine to say that. It's good to say that. But that toddlers, preschoolers might not understand yet the concept of what heaven is. Preschoolers and younger children also use play as their work to make sense of things. So I get a lot of panicked calls, for example, from preschools, from teachers in elementary school, or parents get them, and then the parents talk to us about it. They're disturbed by what my child is drawing, or they're playing dead, or they're playing a funeral. Well, these are the ways that children are trying to make sense of what has happened in their lives. I remember a little boy whose brother died, and the brother was an infant, and the little boy, his brother was about 3.5, and he kept saying, "There's nonsense at my house. Do you have nonsense at your house?" And in exploring further what he meant by, what is all this nonsense, as he was calling it, people were coming and going, they were patting him on the head, there was food, but he didn't really understand what was going on. And as we all know, young children ask repetitive questions. Why? And even when we answer them, and sometimes it's, "I don't know," it doesn't mean they won't stop asking them. So I think we need to be aware that they tend to be repetitive. They have an interest in dead animals. And a lot of young children, when they have a death of a sibling, will show regressive behaviors. For example, children who've been potty trained may wet their pants or wet the bed. They may start sucking their thumbs again. They may want to be held. And I think it makes a lot of sense, because they're understanding that something really hard has happened and they want to be nurtured. I can't emphasize enough the importance of play for children. I love this quote by Michel de Montaigne. "It should be noted that children at play are not playing about. Their games should be seen as their most serious-minded activity." And this is a photograph that Ryan Michael Jolly's mother took of her son Tucker, who is 3, there at his 5-day-old brother's grave. And she put it on her Facebook page and was a little bit afraid that people would be critical, that she actually built a sandbox over her 5-day-old son's grave, because Tucker had been wanting this brother, Ryan, to be able to play with. And fortunately for her, people responded in loving and caring ways. And that this is one of the ways that Tucker at 3 is trying to understand and make sense of what has happened to his brother. We start looking at pre-adolescence, and at least most of kids in the United States, it varies a little bit in other countries. Sometimes kids who've seen a lot of violence or death understand the finality younger. Sometimes it's a little bit older, but they start understanding dead people don't come back. They often believe that death happens to old people or people who aren't careful. They start being interested in monsters and ghosts, or being afraid of, often, because it can personify death to them. A lot of pre-adolescents may believe that they contributed to the death, and I do know that this isn't unique only to this age. A lot of kids talk about, if I'd been a better brother or sister, maybe my brother or sister wouldn't have died. Even if intellectually there's nothing they could have done, it's not unusual for them to believe that they contributed in some way. And by 9 to 12, most fully understand the finality of death. Then we look at this time of adolescence, which is really roughly something like 12 to 20, 23 or so, and the teen years are in there. But developing identity in a confusing time. And what's so challenging for teens is they're at that time of trying to break away from family. And when a sibling dies, there's a pull back into family. So it's kind of a push and a pull that can happen with them. A lot of our parents of teens say they don't know how their child's doing because they're not outwardly expressing their feelings. And I usually say, well, did they before the death? And if they say no, then I say, well, they're probably not going to change dramatically. Like non-talkers aren't going to become talkers, and talkers aren't going to be quiet necessarily. Teens are often philosophical about life and death. They're really searching for meaning, and they're searching for why. Why did this happen? Why me? Why our family? Why now? And the best way to work with teens and to deal with teens is to listen to them, because it's through listening that you find out what they're really struggling with and searching for, and asking questions. Whether they show it or not, they're affected deeply. And they may appear to be coping well when they're not. I think that many of us forget about our own teen years and how much for many of us, our peer groups, not to say that they necessarily became more important than our family, but that we shared a lot, many of us as teens, with our peer groups that we didn't share with our parents or necessarily even our siblings. And they're trying to break away and independent at the same time that there's a pull back to family. Some of the common things that we hear from kids of various ages, some of the struggles that they have are, I didn't get to be a sister or a brother. I look at my own life and in my discussions with my 87-year-old mother, and I have 2 older brothers, and I never got to have a sister. I had a sister who died, an older sister, but I never got to be a sister or have a sister. And I often have thought over the years, I wonder if my sister would have supported me in that, or what she would have been like if she had lived. And so that's one thing that sometimes siblings struggle with. Another is, for some of them now, I have to be the perfect kid, kind of to make up for the loss that my parent or parents have experienced because of the death of my sibling. Like I have to be twice as good or twice as smart or twice as successful, and that can be a lot of pressure. So I sometimes worry about the siblings who become super performers as much as the kids who seem to be depressed or withdrawn. Another common thing to hear from siblings is everyone's been focusing on my ill brother or my ill sister for so long. I feel like I've been forgotten. I know that children are often called the forgotten grievers, and that when a child is in the medical system, necessarily the focus of the parent or parents needs to be on the immediate needs of that child. And so sometimes siblings feel and say things like, I don't feel like I really got to have a childhood. I feel like all my parents' energy has gone toward my brother or sister who died. Another common theme from teens and some of the younger kids is, I wonder if my parents ever wish it were me who died instead of my sister. Depending on the age of the child who died, a lot of kids sometimes say to each other, I wish you were dead, or I wish we didn't have you, or and then through magical thinking, believe that in some way their thoughts contributed to that outcome, which is, did I cause or contribute to the death? And none of this has to be logical. I've had kids who had someone die in a car crash say they wonder if their sibling died in a car crash because they were bad at school that day. So I think kids struggle with that even when logically we wouldn't expect them to. Another thing we hear from kids is, my mom got really overprotective of me since my sister died, which can be particularly challenging for teens who are trying to pull away and become independent. And it's understandable for parents who've had a child die to want to overprotect and make sure nothing happens to their other child or remaining children. Another question that kids have is, am I at risk for dying too? Will I get this disease? Or will my children, if I have them, have this disease? And I think we need to answer them as honestly and responsibly as we can. For younger children, for example, we say things like, if a child died in the hospital and then a year later you as a parent need to go in the hospital for something and your child is panicked, well, they may have made an association that hospitals are where people go to die. So we have to be careful in the language that we use. Or she died in her sleep, then children are afraid to go to sleep. They can be very literal. Another thing that can be challenging for children and teens who've had a sibling die is, now I'm different from my friends and other kids my age. I hear a lot of kids say, I had to grow up faster. I've also heard a lot of kids much later in their lives say, I think I'm more mature than my friends because I had to deal with harder stuff than they did. But it can be isolating. And also, as we as adults sometimes prioritize or find out who's really there for us, the same happens with kids. They lose friends or they find out who really can be there for them. Some of the kids talk about taking on a lot of other chores that other kids don't have to do or that they didn't have to do before. So how can we help our kids? Well, here are some of the things they need. They need good modeling. They need to know that it's okay to cry. As parents and as adults, we need to make sure that we are getting our own needs met so that we're not asking our children to take care of us. But it's okay to see us cry. It's okay to bring up the name. It's important to keep that memory alive. But they're looking at us to see how to handle grief. They also need clear, honest communication, honest answers to our questions, even when those answers are, I don't know. They need to be understood. This photo here is from a room at the Dougy Center where kids can play on a stage and do dress up. And a lot of times through puppetry or through acting and through becoming someone else, we find out what it is they're really wondering about. This is another room that's a sand tray and water play room for younger kids. They need choices. They need to be included. A lot of times we talk around them and as if they're not there or as if they're not listening. And there's nothing as powerless as having a child die and not being able to do anything about it. And for children, having a sibling die and not being able to do anything about it and seeing their parent or parents in pain as well also encourages that kind of powerlessness. And one of the things that we can do to help kids not be overwhelmed by powerlessness is to give them choices, informed choices, and include them in decisions when it's viable to do so. They also need a sense of safety and security. They need to know where you are. They need, if you're going to be late, for you to let them know you're going to be late. And a lot of kids, understandably, feel less safe and less secure after the death of a sibling. They also need consistency and discipline. So we need to keep our boundaries, flexibility as well. But sometimes parents get a little too free on things that prior to the death they may not have allowed, and that's not always helpful. They need permission to express or not express how they're feeling and what they're going through. And they also need avenues for expression. We get a lot of kids here at the Dougy Center who are being told, don't be angry, because people don't like their behavior when they're angry. Understandably, we tell kids, you can be angry, but you can't bite people, and you can't kick people, and you can't. So let's find ways that you can be angry without hurting anybody. This particular photo is our room we call the volcano room. It's a big energy room and a way to get physical energy outside of our bodies without hurting anyone and without hurting oneself. They also need a sense of control. We have a room at the Dougy Center that's called a hospital room, and it's a recreation. It's a playroom, but it's a recreation of a hospital room. And one of the things I can tell you is in that room, when children are playing, they never want to be the patient. They always want to be the doctor or the nurse. They want to be able to make things better. So any ways that we can help them have control will be helpful to them. They also need memorialization, connection, meaning making, remembering. I know so many parents who say it's, I can see people get these looks when I bring up my child's name as if I've forgotten or something. And we want to talk about our child. We want to keep their memory alive, and finding ways to do that can be really helpful for children. And my last comments before we have some time to respond, ask questions, or give comments is just some tips around self-care and supporting each other or someone you know who is a grieving parent. These are things we pretty much know, but we don't necessarily do, and they're more important than ever when you're grieving. One is exercise, keeping your body moving, even if it's just walking. And I don't mean you have to go to the gym 5 times a week, but grief, bereavement saps our energy, and getting out in nature, walking, moving will be helpful to us. Hydrating, getting the sleep you need, finding or making support systems, continuing the connection as you wish to with your deceased child, not letting other people tell you what you should or shouldn't do in regards to that. even things like putting their clothes away, or, I've had parents say, yes, a psychiatrist told me, for example, I need to get rid of all of my son's belongings, and I didn't want to, and I would say, well, you don't have to. You need to do what feels right for you. Don't allow the opinions or experience of others to dictate what yours are or should be. Find to listen, find to ask, but make your own decisions. There's no rigid right or wrong around these issues. And if you want to be helpful, share memories. Listen without judgment. Don't tell people what to do, think, or feel. Listen without attempting to fix the pain, because you can't fix the pain. And then when you think you've listened all you can listen some more. Some things to avoid: minimizing, and these are easy traps to fall into. If you find yourself wanting to say "at least," stop. Because pretty much any sentence that begins with "at least" is going to minimize. At least you didn't suffer. At least you have other children. At least you can have other children. None of those statements are helpful. You also don't want to glorify bereaved parents. Oh, you're so courageous. Parents are thinking, well, I didn't ask for this. You don't know what I look like in the morning and how hard it is to get up. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how I do it either. I can't imagine what you're going through. I remember a mom whose son died, and she said, people keep saying to me, I can't imagine what you're going through, and I didn't know how to respond, and I finally realized how I wanted to respond. And she said, here's what I wanted to say. I wouldn't want you to have to imagine what I'm going through. And when people say, I wouldn't be able to be as strong as you are, or as whatever, these are not helpful things. If you want to be helpful, don't say things like every cloud has a silver lining. Don't say everything happens for a reason. God needed him or her. She has her angel wings. He's in a better place. Only the good die young. I want to have one caveat to this. If you, as the bereaved parent, want to say everything happens for a reason, you get to. But you don't get to have other people telling you that. If you envision your child in heaven with angel wings, and that is a helpful image for you, great. But it isn't a helpful image for everyone. So that's where imposing our own beliefs on other people is not helpful. And these are just a few. I'm sure many of you could come up with other things that people have said to you that aren't helpful. Now, if you want to be helpful, go back, really to listening. And one of our moms here, Jody, whose son Silas died at the age of 3, said recently in one of our podcasts, I wouldn't say that it's gotten better or easier, but it's like I have this grief in my pocket and it's always there, but sometimes I notice it more than others. Silas would be 6 this year, so 3 years later. I think we need to understand that grief over the death of a child is not something that has a magic finish line. We'll always be wondering what they would be doing now, what we're missing now, and that's okay. So I think I'll end there, and we'll open to discussion or questions or comments. I think Gina will share those, and I will respond.
Thank you so much for that talk. We do have a few questions, and if anyone else wants to submit any questions or comments, go ahead and use the question box on your control panel. So to start, this is from one of the listeners. Children who have lost a sibling, do they tend to understand the finality of death earlier? My oldest was almost 3 when we lost his brother, year-long hospital stay, knew it was coming and discussed it with him. He's almost 5 now and doesn't ask about him coming back anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the key to that is the part around we involved him. There was a year-long hospitalization. I think that if children are involved and included in what's going on, that they can understand earlier than other children. But I've seen children who weren't involved say they had a sibling who was in and out of the hospital for a year or longer, but had not in any way been included as part of how serious things were. And really, I think that's the key, is to keep them involved without scaring them and but answering their questions honestly. So yes, they can understand at a younger age when they've been involved.
Okay, thank you for that. And this is a follow-up question from the same person who submitted the previous one. My son says he wants another brother because his healthy living sister bothers him sometimes. Brother was in a hospital bed and on a paralytic drip a lot of his life. How do I explain to him that a healthy brother would act just like a healthy sister?
Probably the same way. Although, I think that we often, even as adults, not just as children, there are special bonds that can happen between same gender siblings. So I think I would frame it more like, well, brothers and sisters, brothers can be annoying too, like sisters can, and not every brother likes every brother of theirs, and but I would recommend asking more like, well, what do you think a brother would do that your sister doesn't do, and how would you relate to a brother that you don't relate to your sister? Just finding those kind of finding out what he's thinking about and what the issues are, and just engaging in the conversation.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. In your experience with grieving children, pre-adolescents, what recommendations do you have for talking with your child about having more children? And if the parents would really like to grow the family, either by pregnancy or adoption, how do you approach the surviving child's concerns or objections to growing the family?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think most of us ask our children for permission ever. Like, is it okay with you if we have another child? I think with older kids, sometimes people might do that, but, these are really more adult decisions than children's decisions. However, I think it's not a bad idea to include and involve them in just saying, we're thinking about having another child, and we don't know whether we want to have one ourselves or whether we're thinking about adopting. How does that sound to you? Not asking permission, making sure that you're not saying it's up to you, because that's too much responsibility to give to a child, but to say, there's a lot of pros and cons, and we want to discuss it with you. We want to get your input. So I think
yes, he actually just wrote in, yes, definitely not asking permission, but giving them the room to express any worries or reservations.
Yes, and to say, yeah, those, I would, and express some of your own as well. Like, what if something happened to that child, or what if, there's all kinds of what ifs, and I think that's one of the things that happens when a child dies is the what ifs become so much bigger. What if this and what if that? And a lot of the things we worry about never happen, and a lot of the things that happen aren't things we could have imagined that we would need to worry about. So I think it's helpful to involve siblings in those kinds of discussions. what are your, it's not unlike, I mean, it's different, but it's not unlike when a spouse dies. Do you ask your children for permission to date again? Probably not. But if you meet someone that you want your children to meet, you start thinking like, how do I prepare them for this? And how do I get their feelings about this so that they don't feel that I'm abandoning them, or, there's all kinds of issues. But again, I would say listen more than talk. Just find out what their thoughts are and what they're struggling with, if they are.
Okay, thank you. The parent said thank you for that comment. There's no other questions in the queue. So unless there's any last minute questions that come in the next couple seconds, I think it's just approaching an hour. So we're gonna end the presentation. But I wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Schuurman, for sharing your time and your expertise with us and with our members. We really appreciate it, and we're very grateful to you for spending time with us. And Dr. Schuurman did also offer to provide her slides for anyone that is interested in referring back to them. So if you are interested in them, feel free to send me an email and we'll get them to you as well. And as a reminder, the presentation will be posted on our website if you did want to go back and listen to any pieces of it again. So we'll let you know when that's posted. But thank you again, Dr. Schuurman. And
you're welcome. And I would also, if anyone has any specific questions that they just want to direct to me, I'm happy to respond to those on my email, which is donna@dougy, DOUGY.org.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for those who attended the webinar tonight. And thank you again, and take care.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.